And then there's also a reaction right now in certain literary circles in Canada that Canadian history is unimportant, that it's the contemporary, it's the here and now that is what we should be writing about. But you know, I hold the very kind of simple belief that your past is right here beside you in your present, and then that where you're going is as much dictated as about what happened before you were born as your rather short life is, you know, in the scheme of things is going to dictate.
So we were talking just before about this very interesting thing, that here's two groups of men, two pairs of men, who in a way you could say had intense married lives without the sex. You know, I mean, I never thought of it that way.
Well,
you know, you know, they were couples.
Yeah, absolutely.
They were couples.
They were brought together by circumstance. Yeah, absolutely.
But they had to survive in a way which was well beyond politics.
Yeah.
It's not about politics. It's not about money.
No, it's not at all. No. Even though a lot of people like to say that Riel was driven by money, which I think is the most far-fetched. You know, he mentions money a lot and his desire to be paid what he is owed by the Canadian government. But I'm getting beyond the point. Yeah, but absolutely, these two men brought together in both situations, and both in violent situations. We think of Canada as being the most peaceful kind of nation, and it's a nation built, like you said, John A. Macdonald popped out of a can, and there was Canada born. You know, he's holding a beaver under one arm, but we were really there's a lot of, it's not violence on a mass scale like the Civil War in America, but it's certainly a type of violence that we don't really think of ourselves as.
I mean, do you think that, you know, there was this enormously venomous drive leading up to Batoche, whipped up by the Orange Order, whipped up by a desire for land that, you know, and so
I think much more so in Manitoba in 1870, you know, the first rebellion, even though Manitoba wasn't a province of Canada, how could it be a rebellion when Manitoba wasn't even part of Canada at the time, which is something that I try to talk about a little bit. But I think much more so in 1870. It's a very simple and realistic goals were asked by not only the Métis people in Saskatchewan in the Northwest in the 1880s, but by the white settlers, the Indians. They all came together actually in the early 1880s. Under Dumont. Dumont traveled and said, we've got to do something about this because the railroad's coming. You know what happened 15 years ago in Manitoba, same thing's going to happen again, is that everyone's going to lose their farms, their land. We don't have title to it. And so they put together it took months and months once Riel arrived, but Riel, with the help of Honoré Jackson, put together a list of 10 basic demands, simple demands, concerns that the Métis, not only the Métis, but the white settlers and the Indians had in the Northwest. And they were very realistic. They were not crazy, nutty requests that they were making of the government. They were very simple, straightforward. And I think Riel was gambling on violence not happening, that the Canadian government would do the same thing that happened in Manitoba in 1870, is that they would take a long time to get out with the troops. The Canadian government would understand, okay, I can put them into a place where they're going to have to say yes to our very simple demands, and clearly that didn't happen.
But do you think that after this sort of, say, the second, after Batoche, that sort of attitude towards internal violence in Canada changed? That there was a certain, I mean, if one's looking for how did we go from being a country with a lot of violence,
yeah,
and in a second I'll talk about the LaFontaine and Baldwin and the violence in the 1840s, 30s and 40s, and I mean, do you think that there was a sort of reaction somehow, once it was done, that the enthusiasm for it went?
I think that Canadians are both thrilled and shocked by the events of 1885, the Northwest Rebellion. I think when they heard that a couple of young children were killed by the first use of the Gatling gun, an American invention, that things changed. At some points, you know, Riel and Dumont were vilified. Like, this was also the first uprising or battles in Canadian history where the journalists followed the Canadian troops as they marched from Ontario to Saskatchewan and as they made their way out. And if you read the newspapers of the time, it's crazy. One day, Riel and Dumont are these villains and these insane, bloodthirsty men. The next day, Dumont is the hero who is deeply revered even by the Canadian troops and scares them. But I think what speaks most directly with this is that a lot of the Canadian soldiers who went out, and a lot of them were Orangemen. It's interesting. That's another connection between the kind of Orange and the Catholic thing. From Ontario to fight Riel and Dumont, ended up realizing that the Métis were just kind of this great group of people who were just trying to make a living on the land. And what they had been told, what these soldiers had been told was going on was quite the opposite. And I think this made an impression from the ground up that Canadians started to realize, yeah, this is, and I think it ended with the hanging of Riel, that we were like, is this violence really us kind of thing?
Now you see it a bit actually in Rudy Weeb's biography in the series of Big Bear, also that sort of at the end, what was done to Big Bear, the humiliation of it, and then people you can feel people starting to feel this doesn't feel right or something.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the LaFontaine Baldwin story is, of course, you know, politics in Canada, I don't know, say 1791 to 1830 was, you know, pretty soft. It was basically, there were very, the right to vote was very high in Canada. You know, we had like 50% of men were able to vote, which is way above Britain, way above, you know, most European countries. Actually, it's at more than 50%. At some points, it was virtually, most men could figure out how to vote because most men owned property. And of course, women had the right to vote up until, up until 1850, I think, providing there were property owners. How many of you knew that, just out of curiosity? Anybody know that? One person knew that. Of course, the professor knows it, of course. They had the right, women had the right to vote. You had to become an owner of property, which meant that, you know, there were no sons, and so the daughter inherited, or your husband died, and you got the property. And if you were a property owner, you could vote. And the French Canadian women started voting first, and voted quite a bit, and then Upper Canadian women started voting. The big difficulty was that as you got into the 30s, the voting got more and more violent. And of course, each side was giving whiskey and clubs to men to stand around the hustings platforms. So you had to fight your way through to vote, and which was tough for a woman unless you were a rich woman, in which case you could have a posse around you to fight through with. And in fact, the vote was taken away by the reformers, and probably one of the reasons was that they felt that the vote didn't belong to women, it belonged to rich women, i.e. family compact women, because they were the people who could afford to surround themselves with 25 men in order to fight their way through the mob. Anyway, it got more and more violent as you went through the 30s, and then you had the rebellions, and the violence just kept on. And in most, you know, people were killed all the time in the fights, in the election fights, because of the drinking, because of the clubbing, sometimes because of firing shots. And LaFontaine, in the first important election of the United Canadas in 1841, withdrew at the end because he'd led all his voters to the single voting station in Terrebonne, which had been put in the least likely spot. And they got there and they were surrounded by a mob of about 1,000 toughs who'd been brought in by the Governor General, another sort of Governor General, if I may say, and who had rifles and clubs, and they were already starting to fight. It was clear that many people would be killed, so LaFontaine withdrew, and that is how he came to run for election in Baldwin's seat in North Toronto, which you all know. And it all began in a place called the Sharon Temple. How many people have been to the Sharon Temple? Yeah, one of the most beautiful buildings, probably the most beautiful building in Canada, I would say. Late 1820s. Have you been, Joseph?
No, I haven't.
We should come. We should do a thing there.
That would be great.
It was really.
Do one in Batoche.
Well, Batoche, we should really do something in the church.
Yeah,
it would be fantastic. You know.